Today's going to be a great conversation. We have Darcy Michaud, who is the VP of HR Services from HR Covered, that's going to join us to talk about some areas that we know employers struggle with, and that is with mental health absenteeism. So I'm excited to have Darcy on today.
Yeah, managing that process is definitely not easy. It's complex. So we have an expert here to walk us through. And I think, from what I understand, it's all about communicate. And he's going to walk us through end to end of exactly how to do things right and do it in the right way for the best outcomes for the employer and the employee. So today's podcast, we want to welcome Darcy Michaud, VP of HR Services with HR Covered. Welcome, Darcy.
Well, thank you for having me, Carol.
Most welcome. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get started.
Well, I've been doing HR for approximately 30 years. My background scholastically was I have a master's degree in constitutional law of all things. Not sure how that got me into HR. Went down the government route, so worked in government for nearly 15 years, and then moved into the private sector. And my entire time in the private sector has been an HR consultant. So I've been doing HR on call, HR on demand consulting for approximately 16 years now with 3 different companies, and I've ran all 3 different companies' HR departments. So I'm really happy to be able to be here and share knowledge with members.
Wonderful. So happy to pick your brain today. So in a world where, we're looking to speak to the business owners, the employers out there, so much going on with reasons where people are struggling medically, some come to you to be off work. What is the top question that you get from employers or HR departments with regards to medical leave?
We get a lot of different questions around medical leave, obviously, because there's so many layers of it. But typically the first question we get from all of our employers is, how do we get them back to work? And it's so integral about what you do in the beginning of the process when they first come to you and say, I have a medical condition, I need to be off work. If you're not doing the right things right out of the gate, inevitably, it's going to be really difficult to get them back to work down the road. So it's really important that you implement the process right out of the gate to make sure that when you do need to get them back to work, or you want to get them back to work, or even when they want to come back to work, you're ready to have them or you're ready to get them back.
And there's so many moving parts, and we get these questions as benefit advisors all the time. And in our last Benefits Alliance Spark conference, we had disability providers talk about that now mental health, and not just mental health, could be anxiety or burnout, are like the leading cause of disability claims. 40% of long-term disability claims now are mental health related. So, there's a lot of questions that come up, obviously, because, if it's musculoskeletal, there'd be something straightforward. If it's a mental health claim and we don't know the duration, someone could be off in it, and you want to be mindful. So talk to us a little bit about what companies will ask you in those situations. I've got an employee going off for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. What should I do? What's one of the major things I should be doing right off the bat?
Fair enough. And, it's a great question in so much as that, because you brought up the point about if it's a physical illness or a physical injury, that employers seem to know what to do. And that when it's a cognitive illness or injury, that they kind of struggle. And the problem with a lot of employers is, or I want to say a problem, it's just a misunderstanding, is you don't have to go that far away from the norm. The actual process you have in place to actually get the necessary medical you require for someone that has a physical injury is not that far different from what you need for someone who has a cognitive or wellness injury or illness, if you will. So for example, when someone goes off and they're going to tell you that, hey, I'm going to be off for a week or 2, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you get a functional abilities for all that. So if anybody is familiar with the workplace compensation or WSIB in Ontario, if you're familiar with that process, when someone goes off on an injury, they get a form filled out that tells you all the restrictions, all the capabilities, and a prognosis. These are all things you're entitled to in any jurisdiction across Canada. These are all things you're entitled to as an employer, and you don't have to settle for anything less. You don't have to settle for a note that says, I need to be off for 2 months because of medical reasons. That's completely inappropriate for an employer to say, that's good enough for me. So a functional abilities form tells you what the capabilities are, the limitations are in the prognosis. And then if it's a good functional abilities form, it'll have a specific spot on the form that talks about ability to deal with others, ability to handle their emotions, ability to be safely into the workplace. So it's actually, you actually have to set the doctor up or the treating physician. You have to set them up for success. And the way in which what form you use and when you ask it is incredibly important. But that should be oiled for every employer. As soon as someone tells you that they're going to be off for any length of time, can you please have this functionality form?
So that great point, because I think there's a lot of organizations that won't know where to go. So where would an employer go to get that functional ability.
Well, you have to log into our site.
Okay, so they can do it through your organization.
Yeah,
great.
We do two different types of things. Like obviously we have our HR services where we provide advice on the phone. And we have these forms, so all of these forms are there for you. But the other thing we do is we actually do disability or claims management. And there's a slight difference between disability and claims management from a perspective point of view. Disability management is something we take seriously. We want to make sure that we get the worker back to work safely in a good way and at the time it's ready for them. Claims management, on the other hand, is the perspective that you want to keep your claim costs low. You want to accomplish one, which is taking care of the worker, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you can keep your claim costs low, get them back into the workplace as soon as you can safely, because the longer they're off work, the longer they will, and that's just a stat. The longer they're off work, the less likely they'll come back fast. So you want to make sure that you get them reorientated into the workplace as soon as you can and give them all the supports they can in the workplace, because that's where you want to get them back to. So, the functional release form, you can go online and grab it. Some forms are better than others. The one that we developed is made in such a way that if it's physical injury, the doctor fills out this side of it.
That's great. And for the plan member, that employee that's come forward, let's look at that lens too. Like this, having a clear process in place at a time that they're struggling is probably going to be helpful, I can imagine. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, and again, this is kind of the crux of it all, is that without a lack of process, because you can't, after someone goes off sick, if you don't ask them for what, or on a medical leave, if you will, if you don't ask them for what you need when they're at that point, right? And they're out there and now they're gone. And you got this note that says, I'm off for 2 months due to a medical reason. It's really hard to get the information you need. Some employees are resistant. Some medical treating practitioners are resistant. They're like, no, we gave you a doctor's note. That's good enough. That should be fine for you. You're the employer. Let me take care of my patient. So it's really important that you have a process in place that dictates in advance that if this person comes to your frontline management, here's what you do. So, it's important that way from a benefit provider piece as well. They should have an expectation with their clients about what they should be doing as well. So it's really can be very much a cooperative process, in building in your benefit provider into the process around attendance management, sick leave, medical leaves, et cetera, is important.
So Darcy, it sounds to me that having a plan upfront, or at least being in the know as to the why someone is off, to me sounds like a way that you can start to formulate a plan for return to work earlier than later. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
That's a great topic and it's a great question. I think what happens is a lot of times employers will get the medical and it won't give a lot of information. So when you're starting out of the gate and this person's off for any length of time and you don't know how to support them and what type of treatment that you're looking for, what type of recommendation you can make, or that conversation you might have with their treating medical practitioner or the benefit company for that matter, about what they could need to help them get back to put them in a place to succeed in the workplace. So that's why it's super important to get as much information right out of the gate, because the prelude to accommodation is important as the accommodation itself. And it makes the accommodation so much more effective if they're getting treatment. And, you're kind of walking down a path towards getting them into the workplace and you know what that path is.
I'm going to turn over to Rob for a moment, because I can imagine you've seen both sides, right? Where working with your clients, the employers, a situation where someone's had the information up front versus someone who has been a bit in the dark, and the outcomes. What are some of the, positives and also the negative consequences of not having that up front?
Well, and I think it comes back to two things: the importance of having a proactive policy in place for all organizations. And it could be twofold. It could be, depending on, and Darcy, feel free to jump in anywhere you want here, is the situations where somebody's in the dark. Is it a performance issue while they're necessarily going off? Is it, frustrated at work with maybe a manager or situation? Or is it just something they're just extremely private and something's happened in their lives and you can't get that information? I think where a lot of organizations, when they kind of lean back on us, or we lean on organizations like Darcy's, is to say, people go, well, what can I do? Right. And they obviously, I can say this as an employer, you want to be very respectful and you want to accommodate as much as you can. But sometimes people are also nervous to ask those questions, Darcy. So maybe walk us through your team's experience when it comes to, like, say, an organization, HR team, or a business owner reaches out saying, I have someone off work. I've got a note that is stated it's for mental health reasons and they need to be off for a certain period of time, but they're afraid to ask the wrong questions.
Right.
Maybe help. What are some guided questions in those situations that might be a little sticky, that employers you would advise as an employer in that situation of what to say?
It's actually a really good kind of topic to talk about, because you're right. Most of my employers, actually most of my HR colleagues, are really hesitant, even scared, to ask people questions when they're on medical leave. And in fact, that's the time when they really want to be spoken to. That's the time where they need to reach out. That's the time where they need to connect. A lot of times, the reason they're off work is because of the disconnect that they're having in the workplace, whether that be, as you suggested, maybe they have a manager that they don't get along. Maybe they're going through, they were given a new task at their job and they feel really stressed out about it. So a lot of times, and I know this seems simplistic, but just reaching out to them and saying, listen, we're supportive of you being on your sick leave or your medical leave, and we want to help you, but we're here to talk when you're ready to talk. The open door policy, it sounds cliche, but an open door policy, if used properly, is excellent for someone on sick leave, but you have to be proactive about it. You just can't say we're here to talk when you want to talk and then just ghost, right? You have to be, we're here to talk when you want to talk, and keep this in mind. Anything you say to us while you're on a medical leave that's going to help us help you is completely confidential, will never be held against you. So give them that safe space, because if it is, there's sometimes that it has nothing to do with the workplace. And, it's going to take a professional that is not us, that is going to have to be the one to help them. But oftentimes, like you suggested, it is something to do with the workplace. And if it is something to do with the workplace, no matter who they go and talk to, that's going to have to be addressed in the end. So it's a great opportunity. That's when people want to be talked to the most, is when they're vulnerable. And that's when you have to reach out to them and say, we're here for you.
Yeah, right on. I think that's so important today, is what you hear about, quiet quitting. People want to be heard. And I think that's kind of imperative. And it's not an easy conversation to have with somebody, right? But I think those are great points. I want to shift it a little bit. Say now somebody's on long-term disability for, say, mental health reasons, whether it's anxiety, burnout, depression, and the organizations receive notification from their insurer that says that this employee is ready to come back on modified duties. But on the flip side, maybe an employer reaches out to us or to yourselves and says, I don't feel that they're ready to come back. Do we have to have them come back? Is there, what are an employer's options at that point?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think what the employer's rights in a circumstance like that is often misunderstood. They believe that it's a third party, that they're the professional, that if they say they're ready to come back, then in fact they're ready to come back. And that's not always the case. So the employer does have a say in whether or not, one, from an operational standpoint of view, whether they're ready to have them back. If you have an employer that says this person can come back according to the benefit company, but they can only do 50% of their bona fide occupation requirements, which means I have to hire another person, including bringing this person back. So I'm paying 1.5% of this person's wages for them to come back. That's not necessarily an acceptable scenario. So you have to work with the benefit company to try and find that fine line between your duty to accommodate, whether that be legally or morally, and also the need to make an operational decision that works for you. So there's nothing ever definitive. Like the benefit carrier is not the employer, so they don't dictate these types of things to you. But you have an obligation to cooperate with them, and you have an obligation to get that worker back into the workplace. It's just a go back and forth, and you talk to the benefit carrier and say, listen, if you can get them to here, if you can get them to this spot when they're safe. And the caveat to all of that is, once they get back in the workplace, especially with a mental wellness issue, if you ever find that once they're back in the workplace that it's not working out, it's really important to touch base with your broker or your benefit carrier and say, listen, here's our concerns. This is this person in the workplace, real life setting. This is what's happening. We might have to back it up a step and work with them to try and figure it out. Never let them struggle when they get back into the workplace, because a failed attempt to integrate somebody back into the workplace is oftentimes worse than not getting them in the workplace at all.
I totally agree.
Absolutely, because people want to feel valued. Like they probably feel to some degree, the fact that you're in the workforce and then you're taking that kind of brave step to admit that you need to be off for a while. If you're pushed too soon, and to your point, you're set up not set up for failure, you're experiencing failure, you're not feeling, confident anymore. And that's a very, very precarious spot to be in. So I think that point is very important. And what else do you hear in terms of great coaching in that particular sweet spot?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate what you said about, about someone coming in and they need confidence, what have you. It's really important for employers to understand, and benefit providers as well, that being off work for a wellness, a wellness issue, if you will, or illness, for a lot of employees, that's embarrassing. Like it's a stigma. And, that's why it's important to get them back into the workplace and reorientated around colleagues and friends. The important word being friends. And that's why it was important, as you said, if the workplace is the problem, you got to fix that before you bring them back into work. So you need to have that conversation, that dialogue. But it's really important to recognize that, again, they're coming back into the workplace. You have to be empathetic that they might feel a little bit of a stigma, the fact that they're lesser or they're not good enough or they have a problem. They might be worried about the way other employees are looking at them, employees that maybe had to pick up some of their workload when they were gone, right? And that's a real thing, by the way. That's a real thing. There's a lot of resentment sometimes for people who have, reoccurring cognitive illness.
Great point.
They come into the workplace, they leave. They come into the workplace, they leave. Well, they're trying to get to the point where they need to, and then other employees start to resent. So it's important for you not to just work with the employee that is coming back into the workplace. It's important to work with all of your employees with that employee and get them to try and understand or get a little bit of empathy about what this person might be going through, because you never know. And there's only certain information that you can share with them, but get them prepped to welcome this person back to the workplace and get them to help you support them and feel welcome, all that kind of jazz.
How do you go about that? That's so key. And people might be very much unsure of how do you have a meeting? Do you all get in the cafeteria and say, okay, so-and-so is coming back? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's, a lot of times it's good to do informal, like you do education. It's not necessarily a formal meeting because you don't want to necessarily make it about the person that's off.
Okay.
You just want to make it about, let's get some awareness about what's going on. So you don't, while this person is in the middle of their medical leave and not when they're coming back, that's the best time to try and educate somebody. And I've always been a big believer in this because especially in the government sector where I worked for a long time, everything I'm talking about was more of a real thing because there's a little bit more. And for anybody who's working in government, I apologize in advance. There's a little bit more of an entitlement in the unionized government public sector. It's just the way it's always been. So when someone goes off work and someone else has to do their work for them, some people struggle with that. So we used to do like workshops. We used to do education and all that kind of stuff about, this could be you. Like that plays, the shoe could be on the other foot tomorrow. This could be you. That really plays. And it's always good to drop that whenever you're doing education. Like wellness is not something, cognitive illness is not something that is specific to an age, a class, a race, what have you. It could happen to any of us any day for any reason. So it's really important to understand that if this person is struggling, it could be you tomorrow and they're going to need your support, and to try and, foster that empathy through education and workshops and things of that nature is great, especially when you have everybody in the workforce and no one's off, because then you don't feel like you're singling anybody out. But it's really important for companies to, as part of their workplace culture, to educate and knock down that door, knock down that stigma.
Yeah, I think if I was in the shoes, and I'll use Rob as an example. Let's say Rob has been off for a little while, right?
Yep.
You're coming back. We sit beside each other. I think I would want some specific coaching of like, what can I say and what can I not say, right? Can I say to Rob, hey, it's great to have you back. We missed you. Like you're really great at X, and I realized like when I was doing that, like, wow, you do a great job of that. Like things like that I think are natural, but I think what I would be afraid of is kind of that walking on eggshells scenario. Like I'm a pretty outgoing person. I might be okay with like leaping in and just, reconnecting with Rob. But for someone who's maybe, just wants to make sure they don't say the wrong thing, what would be your advice there?
Honestly, and I really appreciate the point. I am of the opinion that saying something and being wrong is better than not saying anything at all. You know what I mean? Like, if you appreciated that person before they went off, if you're not a friend of that person, that's different, obviously. But if you appreciated that person before they went off, you had a good relationship with that person before they went off, jump right back into it. Like, don't hold back. Don't feel scared. Make them feel welcome. I know this sounds awful the way I'm about to say it, but make it feel normal again. Do you know what I mean? Because they don't necessarily feel normal all the time. And obviously, this is a strange circumstance going off on a leave for that reason, and then coming back and having all those feelings hanging over your head. Jump right back in and make them feel like, hey, great to have you back. Everything you just said is terrific. And I'd rather someone say something and make a mistake than them not say anything at all and then feel isolated and unwelcome.
The importance of communication, right? So I'm going to put on my benefits hat for a second. And, common one that a lot of advisors get would be an employee's been off work for 2 years and maybe, so like, and, 90+% of disability contracts out there and all employer benefit plans are what's called a 2-year own occupation. And then after an employee's been off for 2 years, the definition changes to any occupation or any job. Well, let's say now the employee's been off work and the insurers decide that they can come back to work, but maybe the employee says, I can't come back to work. The question is, well, maybe I've been continuing that employee's benefits, health and dental program for a couple of years during this time period. Do I have to continue their benefits? When do you draw the line? What are some recommendations that you usually, advise companies to do, or policies they can create? What's your recommendation there?
Yeah, it's actually, and it's a really great question, because that is one of the most asked questions we get from both employers and benefit providers. Benefit providers and brokers all the time ask us that question because they're looking out for the clients in their best interest, honestly. But really what it's about is everything has to be done. It's a preemptive thing. So you could do it in an employment agreement. But if you reference your employment agreement if you reference your policies in your employment agreement, which every good employment agreement should, and you have a benefit policy, your benefit policy should be very specific that once you are off work, not actively working for this period of time, that the employer will stop paying their portion of the benefit premium. The employee may be able to continue to the benefits. They have to pay 100% with the approval of the benefit company. Some benefit companies, because it is a group insurance, are not willing to allow the employee who's on sick leave to continue with their benefit program. Most do, but it's really important. Just that 2 lines in there, that if you should be actively not working for a period of 2 years, and I encourage 2 years. When someone's on LTD and it's 2 years, like you said, it's typically the shut off or the changing definition. I encourage employers to make sure they have benefits for that period of time, because that's when they need it the most. But after 2 years, we're no longer paying for your portion of the benefit premiums. And if you want to continue, you have to work that out with the insurance company.
And let's say if a company wants to put that policy in, they're hearing this and go, that's a great point. We're going to add it into our policy handbook. So it's not an agreement with their insureds. It's your corporate agreement that you have with your employees. If they have employees off on disability right now, should that, and they say they put the policy in effect July 1st to make up a date, do you extend that then from 2 years from that standpoint? Your recommendations, obviously, because let's say somebody's been off on disability for 5 years already. What do you do there?
That's an excellent question. Again, it's kind of a hitch on, if you will, to the question asked before from employers and benefit brokers. But how do you, when someone's already on a disability, you can't unilaterally change their employment conditions. So whenever you unilaterally change someone's employment conditions in a meaningful way, and that's the most important part, in a meaningful way, then they could claim constructive dismissal. So is changing someone's benefits when they're not on a disability a meaningful change relative to how much their total compensation package is? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. If it's changing someone's benefits while they're on a disability leave and actively using their benefits, is that a meaningful change? Absolutely. So you have to treat the notice period for that change just as if you were going to terminate them. So if someone's on a long-term disability of 2 to 5 years, you're going to have to provide a very lengthy notice period. So you would reach out to that person and say, we're giving you 2 years notice, which is typically the max that a court would award unless there are exceptional circumstances for a termination. So we're giving you 2 years notice that in 2 years from now, your benefits will no longer be paid for by the employer. You may be able to continue on with the benefit company directly if they so permit.
Great. And whether that's long-term disability, WSIB, a leave and they're not on disability, that would kind of...
WSIB is a little bit different.
Okay.
Yeah, WSIB, you don't touch anything. It's a workplace injury, so it happened in your workplace. There's probably things you might be able to do, but not things you want to do. There's nothing good that could come of denying anybody disability or any type of benefit or right while they're at a workplace injury.
So on this topic of managing absences and doing it the right way, what are some of the other most common errors or things that people could easily avoid had they known? What are things that you see and that you would advise?
The most common error is not being active. Like it's a great point because like there was a piece of case law that came out a few years ago where there was somebody that was put on sick leave. They kept on giving sick notes. They were giving the sick notes every 8 weeks saying off work, off work, off work. And the employer kept on continuing to accept these sick notes, but not questioning them, not asking for anything more. And then after a year, someone, the power to be at that company, decided that we need to get this worker back to work or we need to get them off of off of our payroll, for lack of better words. So they started to manage the claim actively. At a certain point, the employee just stopped cooperating with them. It continued to provide the notes every 2 months. So they ended up terminating that employee for non-cooperation, what have you, not providing the appropriate medical. The court ruled that because they did nothing for the first year, because they actively just left that person out there and gave no attention or detail to anything that had to do with their claim, they lost that privilege. So that person ended up winning, I think it was over a year of pay. So a substantial award. But basically, I think the single biggest mistake an employer can make is not being active in managing the claim. We have people clients, even up until yesterday, clients ask us for disability management policies all the time, which we're happy to provide with a caveat. This disability management policy by itself is great, but if you don't actively follow it, then it means nothing. It actually hurts you because you have a policy in place, a process that you're supposed to follow, and you know it's there, but you're not following it. So you're the one who's culpable. So, as far as the biggest mistake, not being active managing the claim. Stay connected to your workers when they're off.
And I imagine too, consistency is key, right? So there's going to be certain roles, maybe executives versus, long-term employees versus short-term, like people that have been around for a while, different roles, but you need to handle it the same way each and every time, I would imagine.
Especially in a unionized environment for all those people that are unionized. Whenever you break away from the common, you put yourself in a position where anything you do could be grieved. So it's consistency is very important.
So on the flip side, then, when could it be a situation that if they put these strategies in place and an employee's not cooperating, is there ability at some point, I know every situation is different, where they could frustrate an employee's contract for saying they're not doing their kind of diligence back on behalf of the employer?
Yeah, it's because the frustration of contract doctrine, it's incredibly complicated, but it's also incredibly lengthy. So a frustration of contract situation, it's a little bit different. That would require a situation where the employee you get a note from the medical doctor or the treating medical practitioner that says this person isn't coming back to work, or this person is incredibly unlikely to come back to work, or this person will never come back to work with it even close to the same types of conditions that they would be able to meet prior. And typically that note's not going to, very rarely does it come right away. It typically comes at the end of the 2-year period. You're going to see those types of notes where they've been denied LTD. You go to the doctor writes you this note saying they can't come back and they're likely never to come back. At that point, because you have medical that states that they're not coming back, you can claim frustration of contract. In this case, in the example you provided, it would be a circumstance of potentially terminating the person for job abandonment, for non-cooperation. So what I mean by that is you get the doctor's note that says off work for 2 months. You reach out to the employee and say, listen, that's unacceptable. We're entitled to appropriate and satisfactory medical. Appropriate and satisfactory being restrictions, capabilities, prognosis. They refuse to provide it. The doctor refuses to provide it, what have you. You send them another letter saying, okay, we ask you for it in this date. You have 10 days to get us this form that we need. If you don't get it for us, you may face job abandonment. Send them another letter. If you don't do it, you will be terminated for job abandonment. And that's where you're at. If at a certain point, typically 90% of the time through that process, the letter is produced. But when you actually get to the point of termination, you always put that little line at the bottom of the letter. Should there be a reason that you did not provide the medical, or you do provide medical going forward, we will reconsider your termination. That covers you from any human rights claim.
What a great end-to-end process. So, Darcy, I have learned so much in this episode. Is there any final comments or piece of advice you would offer before we wrap things up? And I can already tell you, we're having you back.
I'm so hardcore about, claims management, that aspect of it. And I'm an employer rep. So, that's my job. My job is to protect my clients from liability. But I think, the best thing you can do for your employers as an employee, or best thing you do for your employees as an employer, is just always, as you said, communication. Communication when they're there, which will prevent them from ever going off. If they have to go off, communication, which will support them, and communication to get them back. Processes aside, which we've talked about extensively in this podcast, communication, none of this happens without communication with your employees.
This has been great. Thanks so much for joining us today. Darcy Michaud from HR Covered. Thanks for being here.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This has been the Benefits Alliance Voice. If you enjoyed today's episode and learned something, please share it with your network.